So a warm welcome, everybody, on a cold night in Berlin. Welcome to our final event in a little series we've co-hosted currently with the German Red Cross on the 20th anniversary of the tsunami in 2004. We come from a previous event where we rather took a look back and what happened actually 20 years ago. And we discussed this with some eyewitnesses, with some local colleagues, and with some leading German colleagues engaged at that time in the event. And our colleagues from the German Red Cross have tried the heroic task to summarize this in a 60 seconds video. So let's see what we've discussed before and what happened.
Really changed my career, how I look at things, how I deal with things, how I offer my services to people.
I think we've all grown with it. We've learned a lot, and I also kind of feel like that we've definitely made a good impact. It was definitely not perfect, but I also think it's completely impossible under such circumstances that things might be perfect.
We must go into much more preparation, disaster preparedness. This is no way to start when the emergency hits the country or the place.
So I hope this gave you some sense and some flavor what we've discussed before and what happened actually 20 years ago. And building on this, we would like to discuss a couple of points today. My name is Ralf Süthoff. I'm the director of the Center for Humanitarian Action. And as said, we are really pleased to co-host this with colleagues from the German Red Cross. But why at all event series on something what happened 20 years ago? Why was it so groundbreaking, and why should we look in depth into it? I mean, for one, this is surely about the sheer scale of the whole disaster. It's been one of the deadliest natural disasters, definitely in this century and even in the century before. 14 countries have been hit. It could be sensed even in Alaska and South Africa, etc. So this leads to the first question on how could it happen that early warning, that prevention didn't really function at that point in time. Given also that the mere gravitude of the whole earthquake changed, as you might have heard, the Earth's rotation and how long a day is today measured. So it has been really tremendous. And one of the key questions has been prevention, early warning, because many of the casualties have been rather in regions hours away of the tsunami itself. So how come they have been taken by surprise? Has everybody been taken by surprise? Not really. If you look at some of the local communities around, this gives us a flavor as well on how could it happen that they had to share astonishing stories, but it has been only listened to them after the disaster. Stories of local knowledge, like the one of the community on the Indonesian island of Simele, very close to the epicenter. But due to previous tsunamis on a local level, decades before, this community has known how to read the signs, what's coming. And so they have been fled on the hills on this island and well ahead of the tsunami striking their region. And while everybody expected this island to be wiped out and the population to be wiped out, actually everybody survived, while thousands of kilometers away, for a start, 9,000 tourists, well connected to mobile phones, even to iPads on the beaches, and so to satellite systems, etc., have been taken by surprise, and all of them died. So how come even before the tsunami started, no local knowledge has been taken into account? Let alone in the response. Donations totaled, as we heard, $23 billion in today's real value. And one needs to bear in mind that the whole humanitarian appeal at that time for this given year has only been $3 billion. So it has been a tremendous amount, and the financial response has been unprecedented. But it has also raised a series of questions about coordination, and led to the establishment later of the so-called cluster system. But some views go until today well beyond better mechanisms and ask much more profound questions, as we will hear today. But also views like one of our panelists will share, what about funding can also kill intelligence? And that's a statement in times when we keep asking for ever higher funding for humanitarian needs, while we face a lot of budget constraints. So this is also about funding competition, about competition between actors, and the question who is benefiting from funding races and who is benefiting from funding records in such a crisis. And it leads to many questions, which indicate also how the disruption of the system has been 20 years ago. But at the same time, it raises the questions, what would be different today if a similar tsunami would strike? Would international actors react in a different way? If not, which reforms are still slagging 20 years later? Or is this the wrong question to ask? Is it time to look beyond the system and our debates about more or less nitty-gritty reforms? Is the solution needed much more fundamental? This is a perfect question to ask for our keynote speaker, which I'm asking now to join me in a second. If you know him, you might expect a disruption of our regular discussions on humanitarian reform, indeed. Lars Peter Nissen has come kindly from Geneva just for this event. He's been working in humanitarian action for more than 20 years. He's been based in Latin America, Africa, South Asia, etc. He's a co-founder and director of ACAPS, an organization providing analysis and data on the impact of crisis, and really crucial one, as I could experience myself, for example, being based in MENA. He hosts the weekly podcast Humanitarian, which is a recommendation as well. And while being Danish, he has been so kind to share that in his spare time, coming to Germany, he shared he loves to brew beer. So with all these key qualifications, I hand over to Lars for his input, and the floor is yours. Thanks a lot. No, sorry, you need the mic.
Like this? We good? Can you hear me? All right. So the beer, we can talk about the recipes after the presentation. Thank you so much, Ralph, and thank you for the invitation to come and speak tonight. I wanted to start with a joke. It's an old Irish joke about a guy who gets lost in Ireland, and he says, do you know how I can get to the post office? And the answer, he says, the man he meets says, I don't know, but if I were you, I wouldn't start from here. Right? Whenever I use that joke, people come afterwards and say, you didn't tell it right, it doesn't really mean what you said. So come talk to me afterwards if you think that. But I wanted to start with that because it's that's the question I ask myself. Are we starting from the right place when we talk about learning, when we talk about being prepared for the next tsunami? And I think one thing we know for sure is that what the tsunami was a black swan. It was a thing that sucker punched us. It was something we did not expect it to be. And in the nature of black swans, the next one will not be a tsunami. Right? So how do you prepare for that? That's some of the reflections, or some of the issues I'll try to speak through tonight. I mean, the tsunami challenged the system and pushed us into a space where we couldn't pretend like we could manage and cope. I'm not saying this to belittle the work that was done by the people we call victims or affected population, or to belittle the work of all of the colleagues who did tremendous and fantastic work. But as a system, as a humanitarian system, we were pushed to the edge of our capacity. There's no doubt about that. And there's no doubt that we will be again. And so what have we? I was talking to a colleague in Geneva yesterday, and I told him I was coming here, and we're saying, do we think we would do better today if we had the tsunami? And it was Ed Schengenberg who runs a think tank in Geneva, and he says maybe we would do worse because we've developed so many policies and systems on top of what we had that actually we probably wouldn't perform as well. And that's of course thought-provoking if that's the case. It's not possible to do justice to the complexity of the topic I will try to cover in 15 minutes, so please forgive me for being very selective in what I have picked out. I try to take some guiding points that I picked up over the years that have made me think, and that's what I would like to share with you. And maybe we could begin with a couple of numbers. What has changed since the tsunami? In 25, the expenditure, the humanitarian expenditure, was just below $10 billion. And last year was 38.5. So that's a quadrupling of the humanitarian expenditure. If you look at how much WFP is spending, it's almost the same as the entire humanitarian expenditure back then if you calculate in the prices of the day. And so as an industry, we have grown tremendously. Yet we are only still the size of the bubblegum industry. And so what I think is interesting to reflect on is, do we feel like we have grown to 4 times the size we were 20 years ago? Or are we speed blind? Or are we worried that recent elections in various countries will lead to a reduction in budgets and we don't know how to find our way out of that? Do we actually know what we are in relation to the rest of the world's economy? Do we actually understand the problem we are trying to solve? Do we know how much money? Is it 400 billion we need to fix the problem we deal with? Can we absorb 400 billion? Are we scalable the way we are? So what is our sense of proportion? How do we understand ourselves and the role we play and the problem we are trying to address in relation to the rest of the world? And do we really have a sense of how we have changed? So that's one thing that I have been reflecting on, right? The whole humanitarian economy and how perverted and detached from the rest of the world it seems to be, in terms of size, of the problem we're trying to change, in terms of the money we're able to attract, and not least the way we think about money and size and scale and how we can maximize our impact. Then, of course, it's hard to speak about the past 20 years without also looking at the 3 large reforms we have had. It started with, of course, with humanitarian reform. Jan Egeland, based very much on Darfur and the tsunami, kicked that forward. It gave us the cluster system as probably the most visible change. And it really made a difference, I think. I think if you think about the world before the cluster system, there were some things we weren't able to do that we do much better today. But when you then look at the 3 reforms or the 2 reforms that followed, it's clear that they have something in common. First of all, they're diminishing returns on the reforms, right? I think if you look at humanitarian reform, that was a positive change that was needed for the system. I'm not sure what the transformative agenda did for us. And while the Grand Bargain obviously has created momentum and kicked some things forward, clearly there are some residual problems that we are not able to solve and that I don't think we can solve with humanitarian reforms with this strategy. And those problems in particular deal with issues that creates risk for the system. So what we call the participation revolution, if we were really serious about that, if we really wanted to empower and shift the power to the people we serve, that would create a fiduciary risk for the system, and that's why it's not happening. You could argue the same thing with a policy debate I've been very involved in, which is around assessment and analysis. How do we actually shape the humanitarian narrative? How do we actually agree on what the problem is we're trying to solve? And that policy debate has been moving nowhere slowly for the past 15 years. Right? We're not solving the basic problems. We're not finding a better way of creating a credible evidence base for actually making decisions about what we do and what we do not do. So while I think it is fantastic that we have pushed forward and tweaked the humanitarian architecture, I don't think we can expect much more to come out of the next iteration of the Grand Bargain. I think we're on 3.0 now. I don't think that's where the energy is, and I think the residual problems we have, probably we need to go look somewhere else and find different types of strategies to address those problems. One thing that really strikes me when I read the documents behind these three reforms is that the analysis is excellent. If you look at the way it pinpoints the problems and what it chooses to actually deal with, I'd say that's exactly right. All of the solutions have one thing in common, and that is that they are defined to be able to be implemented by agencies such as the ISC agencies. So we think quite clearly when we diagnose our own problems, but when we try to actually seek solutions, as far as I can see, we are unable to imagine that anybody but the current incumbents are able to kick the humanitarian sector forward. And maybe that's where we should focus. So that the first point I was trying to make was around being speed blind, not understanding yourself in relation to the rest of the world with the money. Secondly, the reform attempts that we have made that have created some progress, but clearly also illustrates where we are stuck. I think you can take one of the biggest successes we have, I think, is cash distribution, right? It's fantastic to see how that has scaled and the agency that gives to the people receiving cash instead of stuff. That's fantastic. At the same time, it's equally fascinating to observe the concepts we come up with to still justify having the different sectors we have. I mean, we've heard about cash for education, cash for shelter, multi-purpose cash, that's just called cash. I've even heard about cash for work, that's called a job, right? The whole point with cash was that it was supposed to give people better choices. And so why do we insist on still coming with our professionalism and our lenses that we put on top of this modality and skew it to the needs of the system? I think that's one question I have there. The second one is that on one side, it's of course a fantastic modality because it scales so well. Right? There are really some economies of scale in using cash distribution, but at the same time, that deepens that concentration of power we have seen in the sector over the past years, and that's why I wanted to put up the size of WFP today. They have become such a powerful entity. I'm not shooting particularly at WFP, but I just think it's worth thinking about what does cash do in terms of affecting the diversity of the humanitarian ecosystem, a diversity that I believe is our strength. And what happens when we pump everything through one pipeline? Who are we not able to serve if we do that? I once suggested that actually cash distribution is anti-localization. That didn't go down equally well everywhere. But I think that there is a point there. Are we creating a system where only a few big players will be able to channel the assistance, and the rich diversity we have in the sector today is being lost, and the national civil society is being left on the sideline? Then another touch point was from Alnap's work with the State of the Humanitarian System reports. I don't know if you're familiar with these reports, but they sort of take the temperature on where we are and how far we have progressed. And they did the 2018 edition, which was really long. I can't remember, it was more than 100 pages. But there's one thing I remember, and that was the last slide from the presentation when they went around and showed us the report. And it basically said, yeah, we are changing, but the world is changing faster. So we're not keeping up, and the gap between what we should be and what we actually are is getting bigger. right? So we're falling behind the way the world is evolving. In a similar vein, I was on the podcast that Ralph mentioned. I had Jeremy Konyndyk he was the OFDA administrator during the Obama administration, and he was very involved around the World Humanitarian Summit where the grant bargain was discussed. And when we talked about that, one of the things he said was, you know, we felt so busy back there in 15, 16 that we thought that, yeah, of course there are many problems with the humanitarian system, but we can't take that. We can't disrupt this now. We can tweak here and there, but we can't have that fundamental overhaul that maybe is needed because there's just too much going on, and we can do some more technical solutions, basically. So let's push the bigger conversations to later. And he went on to say, and then when you look at 23, 24, actually 15, 16 does not look that busy at all. Right? So when are we going to have that conversation? When are we going to think through some of those residual structural problems we have in the sector that is creating that gap that the ALNAP report is talking about? Now, I have, of course, now made the mistake that I started out with. I have started from where we are. Right? I've spoken about the system and where we're stuck, and that's somehow the mistake I wanted to avoid. So for the rest of the presentation, I only have 2 slides left. I just want to give you 2 ideas about what we need to do different and how we can think differently about the humanitarian sector. This one. If you think about the current humanitarian business model, it's sort of a cradle-to-grave business model where you get a bag of money from the donor and then you come back with a bag of receipts. Right? Slightly simplified, but humor me, right? I think we need to break that. And I think there are 2 places where that needs to be broken. On one side, right now we have some operational actors who are aggregating so much funding that they basically can reshape the system. They can make the weather, if you want. Right? And I think, just like when you privatize the railways, you say if you own the rails, you can't own the trains. Right? So if you aggregate funding at a significant level, then you can't have any trucks. You actually have to sell them. You can't have an operational role. Your job is to ensure that there is a healthy ecosystem of operational providers who can run the trucks and ensure that assistance, not just trucks, but cash, whatever we are doing, that operational side is, that there's a healthy competition in that side. And the second thing is the link between the people we serve and the operations should also be, I don't think that the same organization should be handing out assistance and at the same time give the digital identity to that person. I think for privacy reasons, for agency being able to choose between different providers, the identity should be given by somebody else. So you can imagine a situation, like I'm sure here in Germany you have the same 1 or 2 different providers of digital identity, and that enables you to log into all government services. Right? Why don't we have that? Okay, in Denmark we have that, right? So why don't we have that in the humanitarian sector? Why is it that we, quote unquote, own the people? Why is it that we duplicate registration of affected population? Why is that not somebody who serves them so that they have the agency to choose what they need and who to go to? Why don't we turn that power relationship around? So I think the first thing I don't hear us talking about is breaking the business model between the money and the operations and between the operations and the people we serve. And I think that's one thing we could consider. The second thing is the starfish and the spider. I don't know if you have stolen this from a book. It talks basically about the difference between hierarchical organizations and more network-centric organizations. A really interesting example is Alcoholics Anonymous. There are maybe 100,000 or more chapters of that movement or organization across the world, but there's no central office. There's a book that outlines some steps to kicking addiction, but there's no structure actually governing these hundreds of thousands of chapters. So that starfish is organic, evolving mechanism that actually changes a lot of people's lives. Compare that to a spider, which is, the idea is if you cut a starfish in two, eventually you'll end up with two starfish. If you crush a spider's head, it'll die. Right? Now, I think that if you work in the humanitarian sector, you have both spider and starfish experiences. I'm sure you work pretty much in a spider during the day, but when we meet friends we haven't seen for a long time, when the network we have across the sector, that's a much more organic, informal way of working. And if you look at what's happening in Ukraine, if you look at what's happening in Sudan, if you look at what's happening in Myanmar, there are a tremendous starfish going on in terms of an informal, all-of-society mobilization, unprofessional humanitarians doing tremendous work. We were talking before about Ukraine, where very small informal organizations can reach places that maybe even the Red Cross can't reach. Right? That's the starfish. How do we connect the spider to the starfish? What does coordination look like with starfish? I remember seeing a webinar from Ukraine where a representative of Russia said literally, we have big hands, we can't get into small spaces. Trying to explain how it's difficult to connect to national civil society. When are we going to get serious about thinking through how to leverage that network, how to foster that ecosystem of small, informal, incredibly powerful actors and scaling their efforts, assisting them? How do you connect the spider to the starfish? And if we start thinking like that and start investing in that, then maybe we can solve some of those residual problems that we don't solve if we come up with the Grand Bargain 4.0. So if you're lost and you don't know where you're going, are you sure that you're starting in the right place? Thank you.
Thank you, Lars. Please stay on stage and please join me, our panelists, on stage so we can take it from there. And it's free seating, so just choose wherever you'd like to sit. So you are my neighbor now. Many thanks, Lars. Many thanks for provoking really in fundamental terms a debate which very often is more on the details, but sharing the big picture where we stand today. So we might have come a long way, what the key challenges are. And I'm sure we come back to all of that in a second, but let me introduce, in first place, our guests here. We are joined today by Christoph Jonen. He's the Director of International Cooperation of the German Red Cross, and one might say a German Red Cross legend. He's been before with the GIZ, he's been with IFRC, and I looked up where you've been in 2004. And let me read, please, that you've been the head of office for rescue services and civil protection in Aachen. So what have you been doing there, and how has the news of the tsunami reached you, and what happened then in this place? And we have to get the two mics back on stage again, please.
Yeah. Thank you.
Lars has been so professional to switch it off after he finished.
Thanks. Yeah, indeed. I was working with German local administration, for the German speakers, Landratsamt, and in the Amtsleitung. So what is the head there? And actually it was including everything from the emergency call center, so the 112 that is in Germany, to the emergency medical services, fire services, and that is after I had worked in Geneva with Lars Peter, and I had to go home for family reasons because of my parents, and that was close to my home, and so I was working there. But then very quickly went to Indonesia, a few days after the tsunami struck.
And do you recall when you heard the news about the tsunami, and did you realize quickly that it will mean something for your engagement as well?
Yeah, to be honest, the very first information that came, I couldn't really handle, in the sense that I didn't. I mean, I heard of tsunami, but it was something, not known. And I mean, I remember then the first reports were coming in, but relatively soon I felt, oh shit, this is going to be really serious.
Many thanks. So let me introduce in the first place then Maike Riebau, a lawyer and leading today the Advocacy and Policy Department of Save the Children Germany, doing so since 2018. While working before the German Parliament and in the German Development Ministry. So how did you hear about the tsunami, probably a bit younger than Christoph at that time?
Maybe. So I was thinking back, actually, and I remember I had just started my university studies, so it was a while back. And I remember being home for Christmas with my parents and watching TV and being struck by those images and the stories. And I think that's also an important piece how, well, we're talking about the sector today, but how these people were portrayed on media is something that is still with me, which was, I think, from today's point of view, oftentimes very victimizing. So, and maybe we have developed a bit in that sense.
Did it contribute in some way that you today are engaged in humanitarian affairs? But you haven't been at that time, right?
I wish I could say yes, but I think I was still figuring out many things back then.
Okay. No more questions. But François Grünewald, I learned tonight what's the correct pronunciation, if I did that correctly.
Ganz richtig.
Ganz richtig. Oh, thanks so much. Everybody speaks German on this panel, I sense, but okay, we won't switch. You're the former president of our French partner of CHA, the think tank über die Group, and you're engaged for decades in humanitarian and development affairs, also in person. Currently, you've been lately engaged in Ukraine evaluations in Sahel, in Middle East. While following the tsunami from the very beginning as an evaluator, I understand your first evaluation on the response has been 2-3 months right after, and 9 to 10 others following in the years after.
Yeah.
Do you remember where you've been when you heard about the news?
Oh yes, I was in Azerbaijan because I was preparing for very early January an evaluation in Chechnya. And to prepare the security of the mission, I was in contact with the Chechen rebels on the Azerbaijani time to explain that we will be coming to the area, please don't shoot. And it was a shock because before I spent quite a lot of years in Southeast Asia. I knew Phuket very well because I was working in Prince of Songkhla University in Thailand. I knew Banda Aceh because I was there a couple of times when I was with ICSE. And I knew Indonesia because I've been working with the International Rice Research Institute there a couple of months. So for me, it was a bit of a shock. So from Azerbaijan, what we started to do, I already organized, just to bring to the picture that we completed a few years ago a long series of evaluation in Latin America after Hurricane Mitch. So we were finalizing kind of 3 years of continuous evaluation of the impact of Hurricane Mitch and the earthquake in San Salvador. And we're just putting together all the lessons learned from that. So we prepared immediately a kind of three-page paper on key lessons learned from Hurricane Mitch. So cyclone with waves that look like tsunami plus earthquake. That could be useful, and we put that at the disposal of the player kind of before New Year.
Okay. Many thanks for sharing. Let's come back to Christoph and share with you the key question of the night, maybe. What would be different if a tsunami would hit today? What would be different looking at the system, at the international response, but also German Red Cross, if you might answer that question as well? And maybe you just keep one mic here.
Yeah, I think Lars touched upon few things that really have influenced and would make the response very different, I think really different today, and that is of course the humanitarian reform. And I think indeed of the three big reforms, this was the major one, and I think it has had a major influence. And I think while I agree with your analysis, I think we tend to underestimate the impact of that because we got used to certain things. But I think the coordination will be, in general, would be better. I mean, I was in Indonesia at that time. I mean, in Sri Lanka as well as in Indonesia, it was a region with internal armed conflict. What would be unfortunately or maybe different today is as well, at least in Indonesia, it calmed down, the internal armed conflict, and this armed conflict never was ignited to that extent. I mean, in Sri Lanka it went differently, obviously. But I think one element in that was that it was really an internal conflict, and in that it was not a proxy conflict. There were no other actors involved. A black swan, if something really, really big would happen today anywhere in the world, and that would be a region where there is some kind of armed conflict, most likely it would be much more complex because there would be many more, let's say, armed actors, not necessarily on the ground, but allies, proxies would be involved. So I think that would make it definitely much more complex. I think from a now Red Cross, Red Crescent perspective, what I remember, and there are some photographs over there, I think it was in a way a turning point in the emergency response structures we have not only in German Red Cross but within the movement. So the rapid response, the tools we have, and I think it was really there the first. They were traditionally super interventionists. I mean, these were strong women and men flying in around the globe and setting up a clinic, a hospital, water treatment units, whatever. And in Indonesia, exactly, there was very quickly the realization, while this small town or small city, big town, small city, Toinom on the west coast of Sumatra, 1/3 of the population had died, but the others, they were living. I mean, everything was destroyed, but of course there had been health infrastructure before, and I think that was really the first time that systematically it was understood. I mean, there is capacity and there is knowledge and there is much more understanding that we could bring in from the outside. So the Indonesian health workers, they had a very different role from previous times in the sense that they were not just basically doing the basic stuff there, but they were given much more decisive role in the services to be offered, in how the setup was organized. I mean, how our patients received. I mean, and I think that influenced, at least for German Red Cross, and I mean, there were other national Red Crosses in other places there as well, and I think that changed a lot of attitude within Red Cross, Red Crescent movement, that even with interventionist tools, and at that time, I mean, interventionist tools were clearly needed. You had to bring in additional resources, but to use them differently. So I think that was one change. What at that time we, honestly, and I myself, there was of course the Indonesian Red Cross, Palang Merah Indonesia, and they were quite strong. They had some capacities, but I didn't truly see them as an equal partner. I saw them as a facilitator at best, but not really as equal. And I think at least, and I can say that for German Red Cross, and it has been a long process and we are not there, this is very different. I think even today, if something would happen, we would very much more listen to the Red Cross, Red Crescent in country and not take this position like, I mean, yeah, it's a big disaster, we know what to do. So maybe that few points on what...
And just using this example in structural terms or in processes, how would that be ensured? We had this previous event with the Red Crescent country director in Sri Lanka, and he shared a bit the same impression as you did, saying, well, if he definitely needed external help in the beginning, but definitely nobody was listening to us and our expertise. And of course, it's a good motivation to say, well, next time you would listen, even if it's urgent and everything needs to be quick, etc. But is there any procedure, any mechanism now to ensure that on the really participation and decision-making level?
Yeah, I mean, within the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement, we have, I think, pretty well-functioning structures in place that provide the local Red Cross or Red Crescent with immediate funding that is there immediately and doesn't ask like, I mean, we want to have a plan, a budget, whatsoever, but it's really, in a way, just kickstarting an operation. That is one thing. Then if it comes to the people working there, I mean, at that time, coming back to what we today call the surge roster, so the emergency teams, it wasn't German only, but it was, yeah, you had maybe some Danes, French, Swiss. So it was very Eurocentric and maybe North American in a sense. If we look at it today, it's completely different. So there is, I mean, it is pretty equal. People coming from all over the world and people having very different experiences. So I think that makes quite a difference. As well, and I think it is a change in attitude that above all, that I think at that time it was, I mean, you see in the, I mean, hour by hour, day by day, it became clearer how big this was, but it was not like, okay, let's listen to the colleagues on the ground in first place.
Okay, many thanks. So that would be the perspective, that it was a milestone in changing the attitude and really looking for truly local partnerships with the colleagues in the operations themselves. Mike, same question to you. What would be different if the tsunami would hit tomorrow for the system and maybe for Save the Children?
So I think some of the points that you touched upon apply to Save the Children as well, and I share some of these observations. So in terms of tools, I think in like data and early warning systems, these things we are a bit better equipped, I would say. Nevertheless, of course, it's never enough, and it might not ever be enough. So there's also still ways to go. I would also say the way how Save the Children has transformed after that, following the establishment of the cluster system, and the way also how our partnership approach has changed is of course key as well. So Save the Children has now also, as well as many others, very much adopted anticipatory action approaches, which I feel, and we as an organization feel, help to better equip communities to deal with these type of disasters. I do say that we have a country-led strategy mechanisms, and these days it's not our way of working anymore to just have people fly in and the Eurocentric model. Nevertheless, we are still on a learning journey, so I think that's an important note where we do try to incorporate all of these approaches and locally led action and to take it seriously, but I think we also as a sector have to be honest that there's still a long journey and a long way to go.
Many thanks. And in which way? What would be key points, for example, for Save the Children still to look into, and where the journey is still to go?
Well, I would say, first of all, you can still tell by when you look, for instance, at the cluster system, which I think many of you are familiar with, but just for those that don't work with it on a daily basis, you have the international cluster system, but then you also have the national cluster system. And ideally, it should obviously be led, or at least be co-led by national partners. And according to our numbers, when we look at the education cluster system, which Save the Children co-leads internationally, so this falls on our labs, obviously, only 3% of the co-leadership positions were led by nationals or people from the communities that they were actually designed to serve. So I think that's a very obvious example where change is still needed. These are numbers from 2021, but yeah.
Many thanks, François. We heard that on the one hand, things might be even worse if a tsunami would hit tomorrow, and especially locally led action is not really something which materialized past 20 years, with a very different perspective of at least a half full glass from the practitioner's side. What does the evaluations you did since then tell us, and what is your evaluation on the crisis you look into today?
Yeah, first of all, let's build up on the evolution of the cluster system itself. It's very interesting because I was involved in some of the two major evaluations that led to the discussion with Jan Egeland, the Darfur evaluation and the tsunami evaluation, and very interesting when the Jan Egeland commissioned this report, that Humanitarian Response Review. With Constanza Dinolfi and David Bassouni. I spent hours with him. And in fact, it was quite surprising to see that what came out of the report is a cluster system. They mentioned that, of course, you have to coordinate better in sectorial area like WASH and food security. But they outlined 3 critical issues for coordination, which are still not happening. One is multi-sectorial, multi-dimensional coordination on IDP. One was critical coordination on linking humanitarian aid and development, which is still one of the big issues. On third, multi-strategy approach coordination to protection. And those 3 things have been put in different type of silos on different type of things. So it's very difficult to go to the spirit of this report that was commissioned at that time. I was the technical team leader of the evaluation of the cluster 2, an evaluation called cluster 2 evaluation. And we came to something quite interesting. At the end of the day, we have to inverse the pyramid. Now we have all those silos going to the intercluster mechanism. While the reality in the field is you have intersectoriality is at the bottom, is critical. And then you have to get up to things that can feed to technical ministry, to technical agencies. But the critical element of the coordination is multi-sectorial, area-based coordination. So this was one of the recommendations we made at that time. It's slowly entering into the mood. There is discussion about that still now in Ukraine. It's not yet fully implemented, but at least this was one of the elements. So we still have long. But for me, there is another critical issue which came out of this tsunami, is the Yogo framework for action and following Sendai. So the whole issue of making society resilient, it really came from the tsunami. The Japanese took up that. I was in Yogyo for the discussion. I was again in Sendai. And this led to something very strategic. How do we support local civil protection mechanism? How do we support national agency for disaster management and local agency? So this is something that came as something really new. Of course, there was UNDAC before, there was the INSARAG system, but it got really a boost for preparedness and early warning. Which on the tsunami area is very interesting. One of the results of this big tsunami is the creation of the Tsunami International Network, which is based on thousands of floating devices in many oceans linked to satellite. And if there is a change of 10 centimeter, abnormal change of 10 centimeter of the sea, it's immediately recorded. So sometimes we see an earthquake where there is a tsunami alert, but very soon the tsunami alert is kind of degraded because there is no movement of the surface of the ocean, so there is no risk of tsunami. So this is one of the big elements. Of course, one of the things that comes following what was said, it's very interesting because in 2020, two critical events took place where I was, in fact, few days after the event to do first real-time evaluation. One was the blast in the port of Beirut, and one was a big flood south of France after Alex storm. And then in both sides, in fact, the authorities were absent, and for days and days and days, the only actors were local groups, individual citizens. The restaurant, the guy from the restaurant say, well, I open my restaurant to whoever comes to need food. So this kind of citizen solidarity, we call it mutual help, which is one of our big research projects now in Group Ready, which is interesting because it goes outside of what we know. And it will require a bit of reshaping of some of our kind of mechanism. They don't follow our rules. We want to impose our rules, and it does not work. Very interesting. I was in Turkey a lot lately after the 2003 earthquake. On the Turkish, they say, well, Turkish authorities, the AFAD, the Turkish Civil Protection and municipalities in Istanbul and Hatay, say, if we have a big event, we know the state structure will not be able to function enough. We need to strengthen volunteer groups that will go beyond, of course, there is the Turkish Red Crescent, but something that has to go much beyond that, so that there will be a large-scale capacity based on citizen desire to help to develop. So this would be one of the critical change we see coming, is the rise of mutual help, what some people call the ground zero responders. So before the first responder comes, there is a ground zero responders, neighbors, the local mayor, the local teacher, the father who has a forklift that can help moving things, that could help. And that would be one of the big change, I think, coming. The thing is, it has to be supported. One of the discussions we had with the civil protection in Turkey is that one of the big fears is all the volunteers wishing to help with a good heart. There might be a danger for the victims in the rubbles, and there can be a danger for themselves or the other. So it's very good. It has to be supported, trained, given proper capacity to function in those extremely difficult conditions which are a post-earthquake or post-tsunami situation.
Maybe quickly taking this example of mutual aid and what happens when the crisis has hit. And I know that you've been engaged pretty much also in the Ukraine response, I think also with real-time evaluations, etc. The issue discussed there in the Ukraine crisis for many people is like really an interesting case study to compare what happened past 20 years. Many said, well, exactly this local mutual aid and the local response has been sidelined by the big international machinery after it got started, etc. So if you can answer it in 1 minute, and it's great that you speak so lively, but please speak into the mic, because otherwise the recording will miss you, and the big audience out there we will reach right after will miss what you have to share.
Okay. So from that observation of Lebanon and France and now Ukraine, we have launched a research project called Entraide, self-help, based on case study in Australia, forest fire, in Chad, floods, in Ukraine, and also in France. And the two things that are critical. One is sometimes you have a place where there would be never humanitarian aid, like Australia. So Australia, you have the state system, and when the state system cannot do, then citizens organize themselves. And sometimes, of course, they have to organize themselves because it takes time for the state to come. So how to support that, how to get that stronger and stronger. In Australia, they have created local organization system with telecommunication support, with logistics, without state involvement. So this is quite interesting. In Ukraine, in fact, it started a lot after the Maidan, where the 2014 war in Donbass and Donetsk, where the civilians started to help displaced people coming from the front line, or the wounded people on the Maidan plates after the shooting with the police. So there is this feeling of being in solidarity despite the lack of everything, and despite the lack of actors, or in a highly challenging political context. And this started to be something very, very important. And of course, after the 22 Russian aggression, it multiplied to an incredible system from the frontline area in Kherson and Mykolaiv, Kharkiv and Sumy, up to Lviv and to the Uzhgorod, to the borders. We have a full chain of solidarity we developed before even the first humanitarian actors start to come. And of course, they have established, and in addition to that, you had strong support to this mechanism by local municipalities. So when the aid system arrived, they didn't realize there was strong state, there were strong municipalities in place and acting, and there was a very active and strong civil society mobilized. So there was a bit of cultural shock between people coming from Central Republic of Africa or from Niger to that situation. So it was a bit of a shock, cultural shock. Then what happened, of course, is that for the Ukrainian people, they were, and we find that a bit in Bandar at the beginning. People were still in the mood of we are in war zone. We are defending our friends, and our brothers and sisters, they are on the front line. So this is one of our key, I'm ex-ICSC, so I'm very in favor of that, but one of our key principles of humanity is okay, universality is okay, impartiality is okay, neutrality in Ukraine is not okay for the civil population. They say, well, our brother, our father, our sisters, they are at war, they get killed. Why should we be neutral? And it creates a big of a tension between this active network of citizens engaged from collecting and distributing food, collecting and distributing water, but also preparing drones and preparing camouflage for the tanks in the same room where they are preparing the food ration and the water bottle. So this is something quite interesting.
Many thanks, François, and for touching also on the issue of principle aid, etc. Last, listening what you've heard, one could sense perspectives are rather different to what you've shared as an intro in the beginning, when, for example, hinting on looking into participation revolution, local engagement, etc. Things haven't really changed, and we still need a revolution.
So I think what you said, François, really deeply resonates with me. And what I tried to say towards the end around the spider and the starfish is exactly that. We see it again and again and again. And when the full-scale invasion of Ukraine happened, I felt like, okay, it's an incredibly resourceful society with a vibrant civil society. If we don't manage to shift power to the local actors, we're not allowed to use the word localization anymore, right? And clearly we have run straight into exactly the same problems. I had colleagues who went in very early, found fantastic partners to work with, figured out what they wanted to do, and were ready, and then the lawyer shows up with 22 pages of an MOU that we just need to sign, and that takes 3 months, right? And so I know I was very critical in what I opened with, and I really want to say that it's so heartening hearing the learning curve you describe, Christoph, and I think you're right. I think we have learned things. I think the discourse we have about ourselves as a sector has changed. I don't think we are as, the the heroes coming from the West and saving people across the world. I think we have diversified. I think we talk about decolonizing the sector, and I like that, and I think the discourse is changing. What worries me is that when I look at the incentives that drive the sector, the way the money flows, the lawyers, the risk list that I'm sure you have to fill out in every management meeting, all of those, the institutional logic of the big organizations, that's what I think is holding us back. I think that spider is holding us back. And we're basically suffering from a lack of institutional diversity in the sector. We sometimes talk about an ecosystem, but we actually don't have an ecosystem in the humanitarian sector. We have a herd of elephants. Right? We have a bunch of organizations with different logos and different technical expertise, but with the same institutional logic. They walk and talk like elephants. And we need some mice in there. We need some different organizations that are incentivized differently, that can complement the way the Red Cross Save the Children functions.
So talking to the elephants, if that's what you meant.
At least I didn't say dinosaurs.
I mean, what's your take if you compare the Ukraine response today to 20 years ago with the tsunami, and not necessarily talking about your organizations to make life a bit easier? I mean, there are these reports. You had the tsunami response with dozens of NGOs flooding into the region who've never been there before. Hundreds of NGOs all of a sudden starting building houses, what they've never done before. But a lot of funding has been around, and as, by the way, François has been the quote giver on intelligence. No, funding kills intelligence. Unfortunately, not the other way around. There is a structural incentive to get engaged in the fundraising race, to benefit from it as an INGO, as an UN agency. And a structural incentive to not look for a participation revolution. What's your sense? How do you see, for example, the Ukraine response by the international system? And have we really learned something if you compare it to 20 years ago, Christoph?
Unfortunately, there are a number of similarities in that regard. I would clearly say, I mean, Lars, I didn't want to suggest that it's all good. I just wanted to, because I think we have in the sector, we have a tendency to basically blame ourselves for what we are not doing well. And I think there, now back to your question, I mean, a lot of external factors play into that as well. I mean, the 20 pages memorandum of understanding, all what we do, this is not necessarily an invention coming from the sector, but that is the way how we are structurally funded. And there Ukraine comes in, and I think Mike will agree. I mean, it's one of the crises where probably no humanitarian organization would complain that there was a lack of funding opportunities from institutional donors, complemented by, of course, at least, and I think that goes as well for all organizations, by huge response from corporate sector, from private people, so the donations on that, and that matches, and I think there the institutional donors should, in my point of view, play a different role. They should not necessarily reinforce what is already, I mean, receives a very strong support from the public, and I think with the case of Ukraine, it has various reasons that go far beyond humanitarian reasons. I mean, that was suddenly something happened in our neighborhood. I think it triggered a lot of things. I mean, that's not the topic here, but I think what is going wrong, in a sense, is that you can't tell the public and say, I mean, give me money for that, but no, not for that, but you have to give me money for this crisis. You have to give me money for Sudan. But I think donors can make different decisions, and that would already contribute to a much complementary funding structure that, for instance, I mean, within a given budget, if you don't allocate the majority of your funding into what is already well funded, but really act strategically and with a deeper humanitarian understanding that I expect much more from an institutional donor than from a person in the street that feels compassion, that even may have a humanitarian thinking, but that the institutional donor then says, okay, now this is a chance to, and even to reallocate our funding. So I think, and unfortunately Ukraine is a very bad example for that, because I think we all experience that the institutional funding is generous, let's say, as well as the donations are there. I think again, what has changed, and I think you both made very valuable points. I mean, the ground zero responders, the first responders, they are not, and Ukraine is a good example, and I mean, there isn't any crisis anymore in this old way of thinking where you say, okay, there is something happens, and then it takes 2 months, 3 months, 6 months, 1 year, and we are back to normal. I mean, normal is that it's protracted, that it's getting even more complex, so on and so forth. And I think where we are, I think it's the relatively easy part is, and I think that functioned maybe pretty well in Ukraine, this the support to ground zero and first responders. But how do we institutionally strengthen them and support them? And I fully agree. I'm Red Cross, and I really believe in the importance of the principle of neutrality, at least for the Red Cross. But at the same time, I very much agree that a mutual help organization in Ukraine, in the south of France, in Myanmar, wheresoever, this is not the most relevant thing for once, and this shouldn't really prevent us from structurally supporting them. I mean, how can they function over a long period of time? I think it's relatively easy. We've seen it in, let's say, major events in Germany, like the flooding in the Ahr Valley here, that was for German relations already quite a big thing. I mean, for a couple of days, that's easy, and you will never lack this. But what can we do that these structures can maintain? And I mean, and that is challenges. I mean, that is for the traditional voluntary organizations like Red Cross already challenging. I mean, how do you motivate volunteers? And there is no incentives to do that. It's not within our structures, but we don't get any support there as well, again, from institutional donors. And I think that is where we really have to look into, in particular, as I think the mutual help groups and all, let's say, local NGOs, whatever, but local and national structures, they will have a more and more important role, and not because we are talking about localization, because it's the only ones who are on the ground and who can do something. We see more and more situations where the traditional international actors simply cannot be there for a variety of reasons.
So the more important might be to look into new kind of structures. Michael, quickly sticking to the issue of structural incentives, of organizational interest with terms to the competition and the fundraising race. I mean, it's definitely an issue of public funding, of course, but if you talk to the public donors, they will say pretty much the same and say, well, we have to be accountable to our taxpayers, we need to fundraise in the parliament, and it's much easier to fundraise for a crisis like Ukraine, etc., than for Sudan or DRC or whatever. And is there a responsibility also of agencies, of NGOs, of German fundraising associations to prioritize crises, which we would usually call forgotten crises? And there has been a lot of criticism that the very same fundraising organizations prioritize the Ukraine because the potential is much bigger. They were looking for the big volumes versus prioritizing forgotten crises. So is there a responsibility also international actors and private fundraising colleagues don't really live up to?
So I think there's probably the advocacy soul in me, and then maybe there's also a fundraising aspect, and those two things might be two different universes sometimes, right? And maybe let's stick to Ukraine for a moment, because I do think we can see some learnings when we look at the Ukraine case compared to the tsunami, because at least talking about Save the Children, but I guess that's obviously true for most organizations. The way these donations were earmarked was a bit different, and thankfully so, because we were able to use these type of donations for a much larger scope. So I think that's a good thing, right? Because back then, lots and lots of money was sort of sitting there and could not be used at all. So I think in that way, the fundraising community did learn a bit, also how to ask for this money, even. And I think in this room, we probably have more people from the policy and advocacy world, but we do know that the fundraising world functions a bit differently, and we have to just sort of acknowledge that at face value sometimes. And then also the Ukraine war and sort of surrounding crisis in countries like Poland, Moldova, and so on shows us that there, as it is a protracted crisis, we do need these type of funds for a longer time, and these funds are still being used. So I think in some ways there are some positive things to it. Nevertheless, obviously, a lot of these crises are underfunded, and obviously there is a need and duty for the organizations to highlight these issues. Does it have to be in the same type of messaging? I don't think that's must be the case always.
Many things. Francois, a key point you raised as maybe sort of a solution or something really crucial aside the regular humanitarian system is this issue of mutual aid. UAD is looking deeply into these days. Can you elaborate a bit? What would it mean if the system would support in a better way mutual aid? Is it part of the system, or do we talk about another element in the whole approach? Is it a good idea to integrate these efforts, or is it something we should look aside in an anyhow pretty fragmented system by now, and many expecting it to be much more multipolar and fragmented in future?
Maybe I will respond to that starting from another angle. One of the clear message of the Secretary General at the Istanbul World Summit was there is not enough money to respond on the gap between the request of money and the need are growing. And of course, working through this mutual help system is a way to be extremely active at a relatively low price. The thing is, at this stage, this mutual help system was instrumentalized by the international aid system and not supported. So I saw places where big agency, big NGO, big UN agencies, they drop bags of stuff, of goodies at the entrance of the warehouse. And the poor guys, they have to use their own car, their own money, their own gasoline to go and deliver things on extremely dangerous roads on the front line. And they do that without pay, they do that, they put their own money, that some at the financial bankrupt at the family level because they got exhausted and they expended all their little resources. So it's the self-help system has the advantage, it is there few hours after the disaster, where we are not there. Even in Turkey, AFAD, the big civil protection system, arrived there kind of 3 days after the Hatay, the Kahramanmaraş earthquake, while some local NGO and self-help were already working. So very active from the beginning. The second is they are able to go much more flexibly into the
so we know about the advantages now,
yeah,
but how do we support it?
To accept to give them money and to accept to organize a system of accountability which should not be a heavy bureaucracy. One of the things that came from our study of self-help in Ukraine is when people started to work with international NGO, say, well, what a mess. They ask us to write reports thick like that. They don't even give us money to write those reports. How can we do that? And of course, there are things we do we don't want to see in reports. When you go in the night in the swamps to reach some villages close to the front line where we know there are some elderly, we don't want to see that in the report because it makes us in danger. So I think we have to change some of our mechanism of requirement. Maybe the other element, I mean, it leads to 3 elements. One is quality of money. Quality of money means flexibility, means proper timeliness, not necessarily 1 year, 1st of January it should be finished, because things do not go that way. Capacity to adapt and to adjust. And these networks, they know very well how to adapt to changing situations. So quality of money is one critical element. The second element that comes with that is you mentioned this story of, I told you this, when too much money kills intelligence. We have linking that a very interesting example. In Tsunami, everybody saw all those photos of fishing boats destroyed. So everybody wanted to give fishing boats. So big money for the fishing boats, etc. By organization who have never done any job on fishing. And they arrived and they started to distribute it. And the farmer association said, what the hell is that? These boats, they are not for us. They will not be able to float in our sea. Because if you are in some part of Banda Aceh and this, the fishing boat you use to go in that side of the coral reef is not the same that you will use to go on the other side of the coral reef. So a lot of those boats were just totally unused. And the few local, few international organizations, in fact, few organizations of surfer. So it was not an aid organization, it was just an association of where you have some French surfers, Australian surfers, they knew this place, a good spot, they were there. They knew the fishermen communities, and then they tried to have money to respond to the needs of this fisherman community, because the guy say, I know how to build a boat from my area. And people say, but we can give you boats. And the fishermen say, no, we don't want your boat. We want to do boats ourselves. So I think to build on this local knowledge you mentioned earlier, I think it's critical. And those guys, those local networks, they have that local knowledge. In Ukraine, I was coming with a convoy and we are volunteers, and I was just wondering, why do they have all those branches on the top of the vehicle? I thought it was camouflage. It was not camouflage. We were arriving in a very swampy area. When you have swamp, they put the wood, the branches on the floor. They can pass through that, and then they take it back, and they can go in an area where no tank will go, no drone will go, and they know this kind of thing. You put that in a report, the donor, the institutional donor, say, no, we cannot do that. So I think to support those self-help mechanisms, we have to accept that things will not enter nicely into our books, and we have to get that accepted by the donors.
Many thanks, Francois. Before we open the floor to questions from the audience or comments, please feel more than welcome giving the word to Lars once again. I mean, we discussed for decades more flexible funding from donors, and some progress has been made, at least by some donors. For example, Germany, same with multi-annual funding. We discussed for many, many years to be less bureaucratic, to have less due diligence for local actors, etc. Is this the game changer, or what have you in mind by disconnecting the, how did you call it, the roads, the lorries, and the people served? What would it mean? Is it more profound, and how would it work?
I think disrupting or breaking the business model in that way would change the incentives and, yes, create better outcomes. I don't think it would fully solve the problem, to be honest, right? And I would like to say that if I sat in your chair, Christoph, or Mika in your chair, I would be saying exactly what you're saying, right? I think where you stand depends on where you sit, as they say, right? And so I think the logic of the big organizations is the way it is, and I think we've done a great job in optimizing them in many ways, but I think we're stuck. I think that the problems we haven't solved by now can't be solved from inside this type of organization. And I think we need to hedge our bets. So I'm not saying it's bad that we have a humanitarian sector that has grown. I think it's fantastic. But I think it is bad that we don't hedge our bets and try to pursue different strategies, that we're so focused on what we have that we forget that there are other types of organizations that work differently, that can complement what the mainstream system does. That is just to say that because it's very easy to sit in my chair and just hammer away at big aid over here, and I don't want to do that.
And do you have any? Yeah, please come in.
Next time we just have one of these organizations here on the panel as well.
Asking for a key change, I mean, you shared that you come to a limit what you can do from inside the system because of the incentives of the system. At the same time, then it's a key question, if you even want to disrupt the system, how do we do that with the power balance you have to acknowledge?
Yeah, so let me give a couple of examples. For example, I work with ACAPS. ACAPS is incentivized differently from the ISC agencies. Our job is to try to provide the most accurate analysis of what's happening, holistically speaking, and our value added comes from, we don't want to do anything about it. We don't give medical assistance. We don't do food aid. We just analyze. And that means that our incentive and our way of working is different. The most important thing for us is that we are credible. And so even if we disagree with the big organizations, it's more important for us to be credible. And it's that tension. That's where our value added comes from. Another example, I worked with a guy called Gopi from Kerala in India, who is trying to create a platform for the tourism industry to dual purpose their work in natural disasters. So the tourism industry is everything a person on the move needs, pretty much what we do as humanitarians. Now, if you have a climate vulnerable location that's affected by crisis, of course the tourism industry has most of the assets out there and can be the driving force in that mutual aid you speak about, Francois, right? But I don't think a platform like that can be organized from inside Save the Children or Oxfam, or I think that has to be independent. And so my call is for a more sophisticated humanitarian architecture that enables us to work in a more systemic manner, if you want.
So a bit linking to what came out of the World Humanitarian Summit also in terms of independent assessments, delinking, assessing, and the ones fundraising and the ones implementing, etc. So another key challenge which didn't really fly since then because of the incentives we know. Are there any questions or comments from the floor? Would anybody like to get engaged? We have dominated it here from the panel so far. And we know it's already 7. Yes, please, Andrea, join us. We get a mic from up here. And
Hi, thank you so much. It was very interesting and also a little bit disheartening, to be honest. And I would like to follow up on you, Lars' mentioning of the black swan, the tsunami being the black swan. Moment for the humanitarian sector, and after this hour now I actually, because Taleb uses this to explain black swan moments are a signifier for anti-fragility. They make systems stronger by creating stress and contingency and volatility, and I'm not sure if that worked out in that instance, and I wonder if not the tsunami, or maybe we should not look at the tsunami as the black swan, but at the humanitarian system being the black swan that challenges us.
Everyone can link it to a final word if you wish, but I don't want to stress you, Lars.
No, I'll be very quick. So for me, a black swan is it's not when you don't know what the answer is. It's actually when you don't know what the question is. And I think the most recent one we've seen is COVID. The secondary effects of COVID clearly threw us into a space where we had no clue what was going on, or even whether the data we were receiving was valid. I think the main problem I see is that we're building institutions that don't handle ambiguity very well. Right? That in a sense, if it makes sense, seeks complicated solutions to complex problems. Right? A lot of the problems we face are around how a lot of bits and bobs fit together and how they relate to each other. And we tend to want to develop very detailed cookbooks of how to deal with a situation, and it doesn't work in situations of ambiguity and uncertainty. And that's sort of the space we're in. So I think we haven't learned that basic lesson. I think you're right there. And I wish we could think about it like that and try to develop more resilient institutions that can handle ambiguity better.
A couple of years ago, I wrote an article called Grey Rhinos and Black Swans. The grey rhinos is something, it's a disaster that you see coming and you can start to react. The rhino is coming and you know that you better stop the car, park the car and wait. While the black swan is something that you don't know what it is and you have never seen it and it's coming and you have to adjust. So I think there are two things which I think important. Part of the breaking the business model, for example, now, a lot of my research work, I am embedded in local organizations. So my boss is a national director, and it's very interesting the way the change of perspective it gives to me. So that's very interesting. But the second element that comes with that is that with what I've mentioned, this Yogyo and this Sendai now, everywhere in the world there are simulation and exercises. So the capacity to deal with events is growing quite intensively. The only thing is at this stage, these exercises do not involve citizens as part of the responders. Sometimes they involve them as players, as victims, but not as players, as actors. And we are trying to change that. So we are starting in France, we have a big process, we are part of our research, to support scenarios not to be only police and civil protection and prefect, but also citizens playing the role of ground zero responders. And this creates that new culture of not being only a victim, but being also responders. And of course, it's very difficult in reality, because in reality, in those disasters, the ground zero responders have seen their mother die, or have seen the kid die, and don't know where the rest of the family is in the room, and they still have to serve. Which means we have to add one strong component in all the processes is support to these ground zero responders. Psychological support, economic support, something that can give them a reward, can give them a chance to get stronger, because they are both, most of the time they are both victims and responders, and we have to take that into account very seriously. And at this stage, this issue is still very low in the radar screen.
The black swan. I do share what you said about both the ambiguity and the ripple effects of the COVID phase, and I feel it goes beyond what we call the secondary effects, but mostly about how we interact with each other and like the interconnectedness of people and on all scales. So I think this is something to still figure out, and maybe I can come up with a summary or a solution for now, but I think this sort of lack of trust that, in my point of view, sort of was at least accelerated during that time, is still something that we carry with us and might be something that we need to figure out how to rebuild that type of trust. Leading a bit away from the black swan, but still okay answer.
Thank you, Maike. Now Christoph has the solution.
No, I think enough has been said about the black swan already. Coming back, and I think we all agree that resilience, local organizations, spontaneous getting together of citizens plays a crucial role. But I think what is definitely lacking is a readiness to really invest in that. And I see this in a way less and less, at least in Germany. I think this is a tendency. While there were years in Germany when the budget was growing, but not quantitatively only, but I mean really qualitatively, where a lot of effort was put into that. And what I see now, that this is not seen as having direct impact. This is not giving, basically, it's not that easy to tell the parliament to say, I mean, this is what we are investing in now. But I think that is really where we have to invest. And I mean, I think François mentioned earlier, humanitarian and development, the bridge. I think that is not only a humanitarian task, and I think we are, as humanitarians, have been taken on voluntarily often. I mean, oh, no one else is doing it, let's do it. And sometimes we have pushed to take on responsibilities that others couldn't do. But I think in particular this I mean, yeah, strengthening civil society in the broadest sense, I think that is very much at the center of that. And I think there we have to rethink not only the humanitarian way of working, but as well the way how we understand development cooperation. And at least, again, I mean, looking at it mainly from a German perspective, I think the German development cooperation, of course, you always had this civil society element in there, but it was a nice add-on. It was never very much at the center of it, and I think that is something where a major shift would really help us to initiate or build a foundation for what then could facilitate as well. And I mean, it would even facilitate the disruptive elements, because it's much easier to operationalize these disruptive elements if you, in a way, at the receiving, quote unquote, and so if the people who may be affected, if there are structures, if they belong together, I mean, you can much easier say, okay, we don't need the traditional organization to do certain things. And to end with one example from Red Cross, Red Crescent, we see more and more national Red Cross or Red Crescent societies, in particular in fragile contexts, where they see their role not that much as we have to do this and that, but sometimes we can connect things. We can bring different people who work in complementarity together. And I think Lebanon is a very good example with all the challenges some were mentioned here, where the attitude is not, of course, they do things themselves because they are good at it, but it's much more complex. And what they have done in a number of places and with considerable success is linking actors who don't know each other. And that is sometimes really very civil society initiatives, sometimes it's local government institutions, and really bringing them together. And I think that is a very, at least for Red Cross, this is something that is a very good role that is in a way focusing on the core business, but offering a platform, and that relies maybe a bit to the spider and the starfish and linking that, so creating collaboration platforms.
So linking it to a key point of mutual aid and connecting the dots. A very quick final word, François.
Yes, I think thank you for organizing this conference. Learning, I think, is critical for us in Group UAD. It's our way of life. Just to, for example, to mention, so transfer of lesson learned from Hurricane Mitch to Tsunami, many evaluations, and then a capital of knowledge we built a book on reconstruction of human settlement in Banda Aceh. We did a report on resilience in Indonesia. And then we had special events when there was another tsunami in 2018 in Palau in Indonesia to rediscuss, this time with the Indonesian authorities, where the lesson learned. So I think it is a continuous process, which I think is very important to keep running. And part of that, I think, ACAPS is a key player in that, by bringing knowledge into the system. Where I think the
word was
and I think let's keep learning as a critical element. So thank you.
Many thanks, Francois. As in any good professional TV show, we have some commercials as well. So many thanks for providing and sponsoring us in this way. A big thank you to all four of you. As was indicated from the audience, we couldn't share that much hope. There might be the hope if we want a disruption of the system. This is a very good time with lack of funding, with a lot of disruption from many ways. So let's hope for that and for better developments 2025. Many thanks, Christoph, Maike, Francois, and Lars for joining. Many thanks for you joining on a December night in Berlin. And now Indonesian food is waiting for us. Many thanks.